Good afternoon and welcome to today's Melbourne Institute colloquium. My name is Roger Wilkins and I'm the Deputy Director of the Melbourne Institute. Before we begin, I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. These colloquia replace our normal face-to-face forums and workshops. Our goal is to provide insights through the lens of Melbourne Institute researchers and to engage with you, the audience, so we can better understand Australian economic and social policy issues. Today, Professor Abigail Payne and Dr. Rajiv Samaraj are giving a presentation on spatial and community dimensions of poverty as part of the Melbourne Institute's Breaking Down the Barriers report series. This is the second report in the series, which is produced in partnership with the Paul Ramsay Foundation. About our speakers, Professor Abigail Payne is the Director and Ronald Henderson Professor of the Melbourne Institute. Professor Payne moved to Australia in 2016 from North America, where she previously held positions in Canada and the US. She holds a PhD from Princeton University, a JD from Cornell Law School, and she graduated with honours from Denison University. Professor Payne's research has spanned a range of issues, including the challenges faced by charities in their funding and delivery of public goods and services, the opportunities and constraints for individuals to pursue higher educational attainment, the role of school financing to promote equality of opportunity, and a general understanding of how government policy and expenditures affect individuals, communities, and underserved populations. While Professor Payne has always had several projects on the go, she has recently turned her attention to understanding poverty and disadvantage. She's embarked on several projects that explore community poverty, the factors that support the exit from disadvantage, and the cyclical nature of poverty and disadvantage within households. Professor Payne is actively involved in Australian economic and social policy as a member on multiple state and Commonwealth Government and University of Melbourne committees. Internationally, she is a member of the IFO Institute's Scientific Advisory Committee, serves on several boards and is co-editor of Economic Inquiry. Our other speaker, Dr. Rajiv Samaraj, is the Data and Analytics Program Coordinator and a Senior Research Fellow in Data and Analytics at the Melbourne Institute. He holds a PhD in Biomedical Engineering from Monash University. His work on imaging in the fields of pulmonary systems and embryology led to an outstanding paper award and a special editorial in the prestigious journal Development Cell. Prior to joining the Melbourne Institute, Dr. Samaraj spent 5 years working in a medical imaging technology startup, where he led research and development efforts across the USA and Australia. In this role, Dr. Samaraj and his team developed methodologies underlying the company's core products and ensured these products are clinically relevant through preclinical and clinical studies. Dr. Samaraj has extensive experience in applying cutting-edge data analytics and data visualization techniques to effectively engage the reader. He is also skilled in public domain data extraction, machine learning and automation, and front-end development of creating interactive visualizations. Dr. Samaraj brings to the Institute his skills to enable best practices in data analytics and data protection to facilitate multidisciplinary research and translation of research evidence into policy and practice. So Abigail and Rajiv will speak for approximately 20 minutes. This will be followed by a few questions from the audience. And then Dr. Andrew Yule will speak, Mr. Andrew Yule will speak briefly to provide his insights and reactions to the presentation. Andrew is General Manager, Strategic Communication and Engagement for Jesuit Social Services and has more than 17 years experience working for social change organisations. Andrew is passionate about connecting the lived experience of vulnerable and marginalised Australians with sound policy and research to advocate for long-term change. Andrew has taken a senior role in campaigns to improve youth justice, child protection, mental health services and affordable housing. Andrew is currently leading work for Jesuit Social Services on the next edition of their research series into complex and entrenched locational disadvantage. This is known as dropping off the edge. He was deeply involved in the 2015 edition of this research, including advocating for government to establish a place-based centre for research and action. This centre now, in fact, has funding and is currently being established. So before I hand over to Abigail and Rajiv, a note about how we're handling questions and comments. For those of you watching through Zoom, we are relying on the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen. For those of you watching through Slido, you can submit questions in the box on the right-hand side of your screen. You can submit questions at any time through these functions, and then I will endeavour to relay those questions to our speakers. With that, could you please join me in welcoming our speakers? Abigail and Rajiv, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Roger, and thank you for the kind introductions. And welcome, everybody. Let me also pay my respects to the traditional custodians on the lands in which we are meeting. I'm going to share my screen right now. So hopefully that works for everybody. Excellent. I'm thrilled to be presenting to you. This is, as Roger indicated, this is part of our Breaking Down Barriers report series that's in collaboration with the Paul Ramsay Foundation. We are thrilled to be part of this work. And what this report, along with the past report, as well as the report we will be presenting in December, really encompasses is the notions of how do we provide the bedrock or the foundation for promoting change and innovation for us to address poverty in Australia. So we are not the first to study poverty, and we won't be the last. So there's a prestigious list of many groups, organizations, and researchers. So let me pay credit for them. What we do think that we are making a contribution on is to think about poverty not only at a national level, but at a community level, as well as to think about how we can better use our evidence base to track change and track the improvements we're making. So the figure I'm showing you right here is based on national poverty rates. It's from an OECD report. And the OECD, using census data, estimates that as of 2016, national poverty rate was around 12%. What you can see is that between 2012 and 2016, it dropped from 14 to 12%, but relatively over the last decade, it has plateaued. Now, this runs in the face of a notion of the UN Sustainable Goals, which is to eradicate poverty. What you will see is that Australia is not doing too poorly. It's doing much better than the United States, but it's also not doing as well as Denmark, which is one of the lower OECD countries. If we were talking about this pre-pandemic, we'd be talking about why is there a plateau. But when I think about the post-pandemic, while the jury is still out on what's going to happen, I think we have to be aware that we could be in danger of poverty rates increasing. And so this is a critical issue for us to really understand poverty in Australia so we can start addressing it and help people before they fall through the cracks, not wait until they fall. So the plan for this presentation is that we're going to do a quick overview of the data we're using and how we're defining poverty for the report, a demonstration of the importance of understanding poverty at the community level, and then we're going to dig a little bit deeper in terms of looking at correlations with socioeconomic measures at the community level, grouping our poverty rates more finely into 3 groups, talking about poverty rates by household type, and then also what this all means, which will hopefully involve your engagement with us in the Q&A session and our next steps in this bigger project. So let me first start with data and definitions. The short version of this issue is that poverty can be defined in many ways. There's no single measure. Depending upon your data sets, there are going to be strengths and weaknesses in terms of how you can define poverty. So it really depends on the assumptions and the underlying data. For this report, we are relying on census data for 3 years, 2006, 2011, and 2016. Our definition of poverty is going to be anchored to 60% of the median income. However, we're going to adjust for family size. And what we mean by family size is that we're going to group individuals as single households, single parent households, so single adults with children in the household, couple households, and couple households with children. Using nominal rates, what you see here in the slide are the average weekly rates or the median weekly rates for each of these household types. This equates in 2016 to approximately 35,000 for a single household, 45,000 for a single parent with one child, and 52,000 with couple households with no children. For our measure of communities, there are different ways we could look at communities. We could look at communities, ideally you want the smallest community, but the challenge you have is that the smaller you go, the more challenges you have with the data, because as communities get smaller and smaller, we have issues with data suppression because of low numbers. So what we have done is we have focused on the ABS definition of statistical area 2, which is smaller than a local government area. So this first figure kind of highlights for Melbourne, the lines in red identify the statistical area 2, whereas the lines that are in blue represent a local government area. If I hone in more deeply, you will see for, I happen to live in Port Melbourne, so for the community of Port Phillip, you can see there are 7 different SA2 communities in our data set that we're studying for the Port Phillip area. Next, we're going to move over to spatial and time variation. And for this next part of the slides, I'm going to ask my colleague, Rajiv, to take over.
Thank you, Abigail. Next slide, please. So using this data from the census, we compute a community level poverty rate across the 2,000 odd SA2 regions in Australia for each of the census periods. To easily understand this community level poverty rate, we split the distribution of community rates to a rank by grouping the communities into quintiles. What we call quintile 1 represents the top 20% of this distribution and has the highest poverty rates. There are approximately 425 communities in each quintile. Meanwhile, quintile 5 represents the bottom 20% of this distribution and hence the lowest poverty rates. To give you an idea, in 2016, quintile 1 consists of communities that have poverty rates higher than 18.5%, while quintile 5 consists of communities that have poverty rates below 9.6%. We can now easily visualize this on a map. Here is a map of SA2 communities in Australia for the census year 2016. The map is colored by the quintile rank for their community level poverty rate. Red regions here represent communities with the highest poverty rates, which is quintile 1, while dark blue regions represent communities with the lowest poverty rates. But the population density of Australia is such that it is really hard to see what is happening in the urban cities when viewed at this scale. Next slide, please. Let us take a closer look at Melbourne. These are the communities colored by their quintile ranks for the 2006 census year. We can see distinct heterogeneity in the spatial distribution of poverty across Melbourne. We can see pockets of communities in poverty in the west and the north. Next. Now, when we look at 2011, we see that some of the communities have dropped in rank and some communities have gained in rank, but the heterogeneities are more or less the same. You can also see that some communities stayed in the same rank. The communities that stayed red represent the communities that were ranked in quintile 1 in 2006 as well as in 2011. Next. Now let's look at 2016. We see many communities transition again, but it is harder to see and visualize all these changes unless you are very good at spot the difference. Next. We can visualize this differently. We can use to help us see these transitions. Here we use a Sankey flow diagram to visualize how communities transition into and out of quintile ranks for all of Australia. On the left-hand side, we have the quintile ranks for 2006, and on the right-hand, we have the quintile ranks for 2016. So this diagram represents transitions of communities across a 10-year period. The lines that flow from one side to the other side represent the number of communities that are transitioned from one rank to another rank. As you can see, some communities go up in rank and some communities go down, while some communities stay in the same rank. Next. There are lots of flows here, so let's use some color on specific flows to draw attention to them. If we focus on communities in quintile 1 again, we use red to represent communities that stay in quintile 1 from 2006 to 2016, and we use yellow to represent communities that transition to a higher rank. In this case, these are communities entering quintile 1 in 2016. And finally, we use green to represent communities that transition to a lower rank. Next. Of the 428 communities experiencing the highest poverty rates in 2006, next, 62% or 267 communities are entrenched within the same rank by 2016. The remainder transitioned to a lower rank by 2016. But in 2016, an additional 166 communities transitioned to the rank with the highest poverty rates from different ranks in 2006. Next. To enhance this visualization and the data showcased in the report, we created a web-based interactive version of this visualization. This visualization enhances the report and enables the viewer to better understand the distribution of the poverty rates at a community level. You can find the link to this visualization in the report. Using this visualization, you can interact with the map to zoom in at different regions across Australia and see the color coding that represents communities that are entrenched in the same rank or transition to different ranks. You can also interact with the Sankey flow diagram on the left-hand side by clicking on the quintile boxes to visualize transitions into and out of those quintile ranks, while the map will showcase the spatial distribution of these communities that you've selected. Next slide. Things look a bit more interesting, however, when we look at 5-year changes. Here is the same visualization as before, but now showing transitions from 2006 to 2011 and from 2011 to 2016. Next. As we saw before, there are 267 communities that stay in the same quintile rank from 2006 through 2011 to 2016. But what really happened is that of the 428 communities in quintile 1 in 2006, 308 communities were entrenched from 2006 to 2011. 119 of these communities in quintile 1 in 2006 decreased in poverty by 2011, but 24 of these communities returned back to quintile 1 in 2016. This level of analysis was not included in the report and will form a part of the foundation for further study in the future. But what this showcases is the deeper level of analysis that we enable by combining data visualization with the analysis itself. Thank you. I will now pass over to Abigail to talk more in detail about the poverty rates across Australia.
Thank you, Raj, for taking some complicated visualizations and making them easier to understand. So if we want to summarize what we're finding around poverty rates at a community level, so this is for the average community in 2006, that the poverty rate was 17.1%. 60% of these communities had a range of poverty that went from 15.2% to 59.3%. Moving on to 2011. Now recall there was a great financial recession, and while Australia was pretty much shielded from the recession, there were communities that were affected. So what we're observing is that between 2006 and 2011, the average community poverty rate stayed relatively flat, but there was a slight increase in some communities in poverty, as well as a slight decrease in some of the communities. And then moving on to 2016, you can see that overall, on average, the community poverty rate is 14.7% across all households. And that there were slight improvements for 60% of the communities, as well as for the lower ranked communities. But for the most part, the story at the community level is that it's showing that there's a fair bit of heterogeneity, and a relative plateauing of rates, as we see in the national rates. So over a 10-year change, if you focus on the first quintile of those communities that are ranked highest in poverty, we find that 62% of those communities had no change in rank. If we focus on the communities that are in the second highest rank of poverty, 20% got worse, whereas 39% moved outward, so improved in terms of having lower poverty rates. So what's important here is to note that there are communities that are entrenched in poverty, but there are communities that move out of poverty as well as communities that move into poverty. And it's the cyclical as well as persistent nature that drives us to wanting to understand better poverty at a community level. Now, quickly, if I look at the socioeconomic characteristics for each community, we can look at what happens. And so this is just a start of a glimpse of what might be happening across these communities and why we might want to think about poverty as a national issue, but try to address it at a community level. So we focus on our entrenched communities. So I group our top quintile communities into 3 groups. Entrenched, so we observe no change in the quintile ranking. Those that transitioned into high poverty from 2006 to 2016, and those that transitioned out of high poverty. What you will see is, unfortunately, for those that are entrenched and those that have transitioned into high poverty, we tend to observe higher rates of Indigenous Australians. There tend to be slightly lower rates of Australian born. Let me note that the excluded category are those that are immigrants. We see an aging population across all 3 groups. And the biggest changes that we're actually observing is importance of employment. But there are some differences as well as in terms of educational achievement. In our next report, which we will be releasing in December, we're going to delve into some of these characteristics at an individual level with more detail. So the next thing that we want to do is say, well, should we just think about poverty as, are you above or below the 60% threshold? We didn't want to stop there. So we grouped our poverty rates into 3 groups. Those we're going to call extreme poverty. So households that are reporting incomes that are less than 25% of the median income. Then we have mid-poverty, which are households with 25 to 50% of median income, and households that are near poverty, those that are 50 to 60% of median income. And so what I'm going to show you here are a series of histograms that shows you the distribution of the poverty rates over time. The green line is the key line because that's the line for 2016. What you'll see for extreme poverty is that that line is moving leftwards. That actually is suggesting that more communities are experiencing higher extreme poverty rates, as opposed to mid-poverty and near poverty, where you can see that green line is moving towards the right. So saying that, so what we're observing is slight decreases across the entire distribution of communities. Moving onwards, if we can also look at a flow diagram where on the left-hand side, we report the sub-classification of poverty, and on the right-hand side, we represent the community as it would be ranked based on overall poverty rates. And what you can see is that for extreme poverty, 58% of the communities that have the highest levels of extreme poverty are also identified as being in the highest level of overall poverty. We see that this changes when we go to mid-poverty, where 80% of those with high mid-poverty rates are also in the high overall poverty rates. And when we go to near poverty, we see it's 70% of those both in the highest level. The importance of these figures is really to highlight the fact that just because a community has a high overall poverty rate doesn't mean that that community only has the extreme poverty rates. We're observing extreme, mid, and near poverty across almost all of our communities. Next, let me move on to family type, and I will share with you very briefly on this so we can get to our reactor and your questions. I encourage you to look at our report. So we group our poverty rates at a community level based on household type. So within a community, what is the average poverty rate? And what you're going to see is that overall, and I actually want to switch over to a figure. Overall, if we look at the overall poverty rate, what this figure is showing you, again, green is for 2016 and purple is for 2006. This is the distribution of communities, where the black line in the middle represents the median. So this is the overall poverty rate for community across our communities for the 3 periods for all households. When we look at our poverty rates by household type, what you're going to see is that we observe higher poverty rates on average across our communities for single households and single parent households with children, and lower poverty rates for couple households and couple households with children. We also observe differences if we disaggregate the poverty rate into extreme poverty, mid-poverty, and near poverty. So what are our next steps? So let me first highlight what we've done in a very long report that we've managed to achieve in 20 minutes, is that we've highlighted that poverty is not a single number. There are deep pockets of poverty across our country. So it remains a national issue. But We have entrenched poverty rates, and we also know that there are communities that have had successes in terms of reducing their poverty rates, as well as we have communities that cycle in and out of poverty. Hopefully, we have demonstrated to you the importance of measuring poverty at a community level and the importance of studying that variation in poverty over time, as well as looking at different thresholds and across family types. We also have brought to you the first stage development of tools and visualizations to provide deeper insights and to allow us for better testing and evaluating changes to policy and practice. What will we be doing? Where are we going? In the short term, our third report is going to actually focus on household poverty using the longitudinal census data. And then we will also be developing shorter insights on how we might think about poverty because of a pandemic. And then in the longer term, we are working on creating a shared data environment for all analysts and researchers to be able to study the important issues around entrenched and persistent disadvantage. We will be undertaking more visualizations and greater engagement with you and others in Australia. So that ends our presentation. So thank you very much.
Right, well, thank you, Abigail and Rajiv. So we've got time for a few questions from the audience before we move on to Andrew for his comments. There's a couple of questions which are, I guess, getting at, to what extent does the composition of a local community change over time? And I suppose you've sort of provided some hint of that through your examination of the characteristics of the communities, or what happens, how do those characteristics change over time for those who are in entrenched poverty versus moving out of entrenched poverty and into entrenched poverty. But does it some of the questions, I guess, are trying to probe a bit more into to what extent do changes reflect changes in the people who are resident there versus changes in the experiences of people who stay there? I suppose would be at a very crude level the nature of the question. And to what extent have you looked at that, and or going forward, to what extent do you plan on looking at that?
I think the short answer is going to be going forward. This is a very critical issue, so thank you for raising this. One of the things we really have done is given you a teaser for the importance of studying poverty at a community level. But what we haven't really gotten into just yet is this notion of what's happening within that community. So you can imagine a range of things are happening. Housing changes. So it could be a community has a new social housing project, and that's going to change our rates. Or maybe a community becomes a little bit more gentrified, and so people move out and higher income people move in. We should expect that this is what's going to happen. And these are important issues we need to be addressing to understand the dynamics. But we also need to understand dynamics around educational opportunities, service provision, as well as employment opportunities. And so what we're doing is that we and I know many others have very long-standing agendas to try to really dig into these issues in more detail.
Rajiv, did you have any further comment on that?
No, I'm good, thank you.
But certainly, I guess the use of the longitudinal census data would be important in furthering that line of inquiry.
Indeed, so again, a teaser for our December colloquium is that we are looking at both individuals who move in and out, and we actually see a fair bit of moving in and out and cyclical nature of households moving in and out of poverty. But we will also be including in that analysis a little bit of analysis that says, doesn't matter what kind of community you live in, if you live in a high poverty community or a low poverty community.
Now, there's a question here about how these findings might relate to SAFER, so socioeconomic indexes for areas. I mean, I would imagine that there'd be some association. Is that something you've looked at?
We have not looked at it. Again, SEFA is one way of measuring it. It's the way that the ABS is measuring it. What we wanted to do, because we knew that there's a lot of factors that go into that drive people into poverty or support them exiting poverty, we wanted to go with a very simple measure. And so we wanted to focus on income. Understanding income is one aspect of poverty or disadvantage. So I should make that caveat.
And one final question, I think, before we move on to Andrew is, I think this might be a misunderstanding. So someone has said that you mentioned that migrants are excluded from the sample, but I don't believe that's correct.
No, we include in our sample everyone who is a resident of Australia. So what we did exclude from our sample visitors to Australia who might have been staying in a hotel at the time when the census was taken.
Okay, so I'll now move on to inviting Andrew to provide his comments and reactions. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, and yeah, thank you for having me along today. I'd just like to start by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm standing on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledging any elders we have tuned in today. Firstly, congratulations on a great piece of research. It's very detailed and very rich, and a fantastic contribution to help sort of deepen this conversation around what poverty looks like in Australia and the entrenched nature of that poverty. It's a very difficult problem to solve, and so the more conversations we have and the more data we have, the better. Jesuit Social Services has been very interested in this space since inception 43 years ago, but in particular researching place-based disadvantage for just over 20 years now, starting with our report Unequal in Life back in 1999, which looked at every postcode across Victoria and New South Wales, and a combination of different challenges that those communities were facing. That expanded to be a national picture of disadvantage in 2007 with Dropping Off the Edge, which we repeated in 2015. I guess the one main difference between our work and something like this is that we tend to take a sort of a broader view of disadvantage as a whole that incorporates elements of economic poverty, but also looks at indicators around health, education, and a range of social issues, including contact with the criminal justice system, family violence, child maltreatment, and so on. We're in the early stages at the moment of undertaking the next Dropping Off the Edge report, and we're expanding the indicators that we're looking at to also include environmental indicators, so environmental disadvantage that looks at things like heat vulnerability, green canopy, air pollution, things like that. And I guess that we take that approach because we look at what we talk about as the complex web of disadvantage that communities are faced with. And when we start to look at the solutions for those communities, we want to understand that the mix of things and the interrelated nature of those things that those communities are facing. Just to give you a bit of an example of that, when we look at the most recent report we did in 2015, just in Victoria, when we looked at the really pointy end of the really highly disadvantaged communities, the 3% most disadvantaged communities, we found that they were 3 times more likely to be experiencing long-term unemployment, 3 times more likely to have high rates of child maltreatment, 2.5 times more likely to have high rates of family violence, 2.5 times more likely to have high rates of disability support, and twice as likely to have high rates of criminal convictions. So, understanding that when we look at solutions to some of these things, whilst you can have a leading approach, a housing first approach or an employment approach to addressing those concerns, a job doesn't necessarily fix the underlying drivers of family violence or of child abuse, and it certainly doesn't fix the disability support system. So we feel like, we like to look at those range of issues so that we can start to discuss the differences in each of those communities. We also understand that each community as I think has been touched on really well in this report, looks quite different too. So where I presented a number of years back to a local government area, and even within that one local government area, there was a suburb that had more economic disadvantage, things like low income and housing stress, and just a couple of suburbs away, another area that was experiencing things like high rates of crime and family violence and child maltreatment. So a very different looking experience of disadvantage in those locations. Our good friend, Professor Tony Vincent, who authored those reports for us, used to talk about dropping off the edge as signposts. So it would tell us, where to look and perhaps give us an idea of what to be looking at. But in order to sort of really create any sort of change, there needs to be a deep engagement with that community to gain an understanding of those challenges locally, but also to gain an understanding of the strengths that are inherent in those communities as well. Every community does have strengths as well as challenges, and so we need to know what those are. And I think I would just sort of finish up with a couple of thoughts, and one is just that all communities do have strengths as well as challenges, and in our response to these, to understanding where poverty is, we need to discover and foster those strengths if we're to make any sort of real and lasting change. And my second point is sort of connected by a narrow thread to that, and that's just a comment about data and what we measure. So as a community, I think we're reasonably good at measuring crime rates and income levels and incidents of child maltreatment, but we're not great at measuring community strength, resilience, community cohesion. There's work in that space. There's certainly some great work in that space, but it's not consistent across the country, down to the detail that we need. And it's something I think that we need to consider moving forward. That we need to understand deficits, but we also need to understand strengths so that we can get in those communities and work for lasting change. So thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Andrew. Now, unless Abigail or Raj wanted to react to any of Andrew's comments, I can proceed to posing some of the questions asked by our audience members.
I think we should move to our audience. So Andrew, very good comments. Thank you.
So we've got a few questions about the measure of poverty that you're using. As you mentioned, Abigail, there's no single universal measure of poverty, but there is a question about, you sort of presented an OECD graph at the start that I think used a 50% median income poverty measure, and you've gone for a 60% of median income poverty line. There's also people raising questions about housing costs and whether they should have been taken into account. And I guess then there's also the question of, it seems like the poverty rates are a bit higher you're getting from this census data using this measure than the OECD, and I guess that higher threshold would be the logical explanation for that. But is there any other reason why you might be getting different poverty rates from the OECD numbers?
Yeah, there's actually two reasons for doing this. So one is the fact that we are using a 60% cutoff versus a 50% cutoff, which I'll get at. And then the other one is the fact that we're measuring poverty at a community level. And that's the easier answer to provide, because when you look at communities, not all communities are equally sized. So essentially, we're applying a different weight relative to a national poverty rate. In terms of 50% versus 60%, when you look across the literature, both are used. The OECD does use both. Why did we decide to go with a 60% rate over a 50% rate? Is because when you start looking at the numbers and what the annual income is, we felt that a 60% rate was more reflective of, can you make ends meet at that level. Now, I will point in the report, we do point out to another study where they used Hilda data, And there was a graph that used Hilda data looking at a national rate at 50% and a national poverty rate at 60%. And it turns out our community poverty rate falls in between those two. So our rate is actually lower than a 60% median cutoff for the national rate. The second question about housing. Here's a challenge that you have with the census data. With the census data, somebody who completes the census will say, here's how much I pay in housing. What we can't measure in the census data is that we can't measure of where you choose your housing. So in the report, we go into a fair bit of detail. Imagine two families of equal size, equal incomes. But one chooses to have a bigger house and pay less by living in the suburbs, so they increase their commuting. One chooses to have a smaller household, but lives closer to their work arrangement, and so ends up having a higher housing cost. Is one in poverty and one not in poverty? Right. So essentially, the point I'm trying to make is that there are choices we make. And so what we wanted to do is we want to say excluding understanding what your opportunities were around housing and choices. What if we just look at basic income as the measure?
Yep. Great. I guess I would also note that I think in the European Union, they tend to favour a 60% of median measure of poverty as well. So there's some more questions about sort of the, have there been changes in the types of areas that experience high poverty over the period that you examine? So they've mentioned particularly, inner city versus rural, and are there differences? There's also a related question about how are there differences across the states in entrenched poverty? On the first question, I noted that the area in which I live seemed to have become a hot spot for high poverty, which really did surprise me, given what I know about my area. But yeah, do you have much on the sort of changing types of areas that are experiencing high rates of poverty?
So we do observe a fair bit of variation, and that's where our visualization, and we have two visualizations. So if you go to the Breaking Down Barriers section of the Melbourne Institute website, you will be able to explore specific areas on your own. So we do actually see, entrenched poverty across the entire nation. Certainly there are certain areas where you observe higher rates and consistent higher rates, but it really is a national problem. And there is going to be variation, and some of the things that are challenges with the census data, especially when you're using the cross-sectional data, is that it's a little bit more challenging to get into details of, well, is this person reporting a low income because they're in school or because of some other factor? And so this really is the tip of the iceberg, and it's, what I have to keep emphasizing is the importance of the foundational and bedrock nature of this report, to say, okay, let's dig in and let's roll up our sleeves and start really understanding, why has a given area increased in poverty? Why has another area decreased? There are both good reasons and bad reasons for poverty rates to increase and decrease in a community. Of course, my underlying premise is that we should have zero poverty, but accepting that we will have some positive poverty rates.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time, but it's very clear that this is the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of one. But I find this this community level study of poverty really interesting and really revelatory for me personally. So I look forward to seeing the outcomes of further work in this space, and perhaps even contributing to it. Now we will. I have not been able to get to all of the questions that have been raised by audience members, but our speakers will look at answering any outstanding questions that that they are able to answer, and they'll be posted on our website. So let me thank again our speakers and also you, the audience. The report for this colloquium will be sent to attendees after the event, and also a link to the report is also being posted in the chat function as I speak. I hope you've enjoyed this colloquium, and I look forward to seeing you at our next one on the 17th of November, when Dr. Yiping Seng will be presenting findings from an evaluation of an innovative early years program aimed at improving outcomes for children facing extreme adversity. You can register for that colloquium by following the link that has also just been posted in the chat function and also posted next to the live stream on Slido. But for now, I thank you and goodbye.